One of the things that we've been working a lot on right now is something that we're calling the Verified Carbon Market Roadmap, which is a clear and collective vision for the entire carbon market over the next 5 years to really say, okay, if we want this market to matter from a climate change mitigation perspective, and we've set that target as 5 gigatons of abatement by 2030 collectively, then here are all of the pieces of the puzzle. And this is the vision for the market of the future that we really want to work toward.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is presented by Base Carbon, sensible carbon investing. For more information, visit basecarbon.com.
Welcome back to Catching Up on Climate on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abex Technologies. Our guest today is Alexia Kelly, Managing Director, Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the High Tide Foundation. We'll be discussing what's been happening beneath the quiet surface of the voluntary carbon markets in order to get them ready for prime time and unlock the institutional capital these markets need, including the work being done on the new Verified Carbon Market Roadmap. Hello, Alexia. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
It's good to have you back on the podcast, Alexia. We're in the back-to-school season, and it's the time of year to reassess the big picture and get refocused on what's important, what are the challenges we face, and what we'd like to accomplish. I'd like to start our conversation with you there, Alexia. How are you assessing the big picture in carbon markets today?
Yeah, thanks, David, and great to be back. There's a lot going on in carbon markets right now. We are really seeing a significant convergence between voluntary and regulatory markets. We're starting to see, I think, enhanced convergence around what quality really looks like. So when I was on last time, we talked a lot about the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets and its work to really bring the market together around a set of consolidated integrity and transparency requirements and threshold benchmark standards. And what we've also really seen, I think, especially with the Trump administration and some of the political changes that are happening internationally, we've seen a rise in the continued commitment and importance of voluntary action by companies to act on climate, but also increasing amounts of green hushing. So as we've been kind of making the rounds, talking to our friends who are leading sustainability initiatives within Fortune 500 companies, particularly those that tend to be climate leaders and are domiciled in the US, what we're seeing is that they're really committed to staying the course on their sustainability goals and objectives. I think they've collectively identified that it's a pretty steep path, and the path obviously just got a lot steeper with a number of the incentive changes in what I refuse to call the Big Beautiful Bill, but the budget bill that just passed Congress. And I think as we look forward, really charting a new path towards just quiet, intentional, focused work to deliver without a lot of the noise. And so, while there will likely always be noise around the carbon markets, I think this moment right now is really focused on just building the durable systems that are going to work within the capital markets and institutional infrastructure that we rely on for the global economy, and to do it in a way that's a lot less about sort of a cute little artisanal experiment of a market and really pulling that through into the mainstream in a clear and credible way.
I'd love to get into that with you. I want to come back to a couple things. You raised a couple interesting points I wanted to follow up on. One is with the notion of green hushing. So I think when green hushing first came out, it seemed to be people being shamed in a sense for greenwashing. I get the sense that with maybe not the increasing, but the changing nature of the politicalization of climate action, green hushing might be coming from a different direction now. Is that right?
I think that is right. And I think it's been really interesting with companies because I've been really surprised at their continued commitment and dedication to the market, despite all of the noise on both the right and the left. So I think sustainability teams and companies that are really leading the way have been getting squeezed for different reasons, right? From the political left and the political right. And what's happening is I think a lot of the companies really recognize that this work needs to happen. It's very important that we continue it and that there's no reason not to do the work because of both the need to take action on climate change, but also the need to shore up and protect supply chains against climate shocks and to be thinking comprehensively about the risks that climate change poses to their core business. And so I think they've sort of collectively decided that we're going to keep doing the work. We're just not really going to talk about it very much. And that's, I think, unfortunate, but it's less unfortunate than it would be if everybody just said, well, we're just going to stop doing the work. So I think the good news, and this is true of the broader kind of global carbon market trends as well, there's a much more workman-like attitude being brought to the whole endeavor, which is really this work has to happen. We need to keep iterating. We need to keep working to get it right. And we're just going to put our heads down and power through, is my favorite phrase from Arrested Development.
Well, and it's such an important turnaround, right? Because it seemed like not so many years ago, the skeptical response was, well, there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action, that people want the marketing benefits of saying they're taking climate action, but not actually backing it up. And now it's an interesting reversal that now you've got people doing the work, but not wanting to talk about it.
Totally. And I think it's also really important to note that there's a big schism in companies, right? So the vast majority of companies, let's say, I think 80% globally, still don't have any form of voluntary climate commitment. We have a huge gap to address, which is just most companies in their business as usual planning are not actively thinking about climate change. But of the leaders, and let's say there's maybe generously 1,000 of them globally, they really are doing the work. And I think it's difficult to overstate the role and importance that those climate leaders play in pulling through some of these early markets and technologies. So I don't know if you saw the deal that was recently announced by EFM, which is a sustainable forestry management fund out of the Pacific Northwest that just cut a big deal with both Microsoft and Meta to purchase and preserve one of the largest tracts of land, I think, ever backed by a carbon market deal, which is just an example, I think, of the maturation of this space and the impact that these companies are having on the capital markets, which is we're willing to make a long-term offtake agreement for carbon. And that's then going to enable institutional investors to come in and say, yep, I'm going to loan you my money at X% a year, or I'm going to invest in this asset class that I hadn't really considered to be real. But because I have one of these big, deep balance sheet and deep pocketed companies on the other side of that transaction who I know are very creditworthy, I'm going to come in and take a flyer on this market that I haven't been too sure about before. So those are the types of early indicators that I'm particularly excited about because they really are demonstrating that this market is starting to grow up and get much closer to something that we would consider to be a traditional asset market.
And that's a really interesting change, right? Because it seemed that the tech companies in the US in particular, whether it's the Microsofts, the Metas, they were very much insisting on removals. Like they seem very much, perhaps not surprisingly, technologically oriented, carbon capture. So to do a forest preservation deal, that seems like a change for them. Is that right?
Well, you are right. And I would actually say that a lot of these companies, if you talk to them quietly, they will all know that they really recognize the need for both avoided emissions or reductions and removals. But because the prevailing wisdom around net zero, particularly the definition of net zero that's been pushed by some of the NGOs, is that you have to reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions that are reported on your inventory by 80% or 90%. And only then should you be balancing the residual with 10 or 20% of removals based on what is, in my opinion, a misinterpretation of what the IPCC says. on the definition of net zero, which is their actual definition of net zero is that you are counterbalancing your emissions with removals over a period of time. The IPCC, which is the International Panel of Scientists who provide us scientific analysis and synthesis around climate change, they do not say it has to be 80% by 2050. That's not what the IPCC has said about what net zero is. But I think there's NGOs who were concerned that companies would only offset their way out of or into a net zero claim, and they wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So they pushed these very stringent and onerous definitions of net zero onto the companies. And now we have a bunch of companies who've set net zero targets and are looking around going, there's no way we can deliver this level of reductions within our own supply chain and inventories. So that shift is happening slowly, but it is happening. And I think people are starting to just come to sort of reconcile themselves with the fact that we're going to need to actually take a different approach if we want these companies to deliver on these net zero targets in any kind of meaningful time frame.
And that brings me to another point you raised earlier that I want to ask you about, which is the improvements on how we define quality. Obviously, that's been a huge issue. It's probably one of the top issues for why the 80%, as you said, have not come into the market yet. What have you seen in terms of advances in how we define and agree on what we mean by quality?
I think quality is always going to be an evolving conversation in the carbon market, just like any other field where you have evolving science and we're continuously learning and adapting our regulations as we get that new information in the door. I think one of the things that's interesting and important from a capital markets and a capital formation perspective is that we're starting to see convergence through the work of the Integrity Council and voluntary carbon markets around a fewer set of kind of key methodologies for specific credit category types. So if you think about landfill gas, or if you think about high GWP, high global warming potential gas destruction, or improved forest management, what we're seeing is that the ICVCM has looked across all of the existing methods that are out there and says, we really think this is the best combination of what these methodologies have. That's going to be important for comparability. It's going to be important for fungibility. It's going to be important for transparency. So I think that's a really big structural shift that's happening in the VCM. And that's going to help us chart a path forward to a more aligned voluntary and regulatory system as well. Because as Article 6 starts to take effect and be implemented, you'll see what we're hoping will become a virtuous cycle between the regulatory and the voluntary space, where the voluntary space is actually leading in terms of definitions of quality. And the regulatory space is watching and adapting and leveraging that work because the voluntary sector can move a little more quickly at this point.
And what are some of the most interesting developments you're seeing in terms of that? I guess you put it a better way in terms of the convergence between voluntary and compliance markets, because it certainly seemed like the compliance markets have kind of been out front for the past year or so.
Yes and no. I think like we're actually starting to see a sort of a renaissance of interest in carbon markets as companies or as countries get more serious about implementing their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So the commitments that everybody made, they are just as they sound, nationally determined. So every country is deciding for itself the way in which it plans to deliver both how much it's contributing and also how it's going to deliver its emission reduction goals. And many of them, I think, are doing the same sort of calculus exercise that the companies are doing, which is, boy, we have a lot of work to do to decarbonize the global economy. And we're going to need to be thinking about net cost of that trajectory overall. And so integration of international emissions trading, where I'm allowed to take advantage of lower cost opportunities in other countries, should actually be part of our strategy. And so that work is really just getting going. You know, it took us a decade to write all of the rules at the UN for Article 6, but that process has largely concluded. And so now we're really putting, I think, the last details on the 6.4 system, which is the internationally managed carbon crediting program. So there's a centralized body that decides which methodologies get approved and which ones get the kind of UN label. as opposed to Article 6.2, which is the bilateral trading between countries. So countries are free under Paris to enter into agreements themselves with how they define and set these rules. So in a sense, everything under the Paris Agreement is voluntary, even though it isn't an international treaty, but it is designed to be very flexible. And that was what was required to get all of the developing countries on board to having a level playing field for developing and developed countries.
And how would you assess the speed at which the implementation of these Article 6 markets is going?
Well, there's a lot of governments involved. So that gives you any indication how quickly things are going. I think it varies by country. Singapore has emerged as a real leader in this space. I think they see, they have a very high marginal cost of abatement domestically. They've made ambitious international commitments. And I think they really see the value of the market from a kind of national interest perspective and creating new economic development opportunities for Southeast Asia in particular. So it's been interesting to see they're really leading the charge from a governmental perspective, along with the UK, which faces similar constraints in terms of their internal decarbonization opportunities. And then we're seeing players like Kenya step in, who are also really active and interested. Kenya actually hosts an enormous number of very high integrity projects that are just delivering incredible impacts on the ground. And so those three governments, in fact, the UK, Singapore, and Kenya, have come together in a new voluntary carbon market initiative to really help catalyze and think through how the voluntary market can help developing countries and developed countries deliver on their nationally determined contributions, and how we start to create just that virtuous cycle and enhanced connectivity between the emerging Article 6 and UN systems and the voluntary action that we know companies are taking out there. So that's been a big turning point, I would say, since you and I spoke last, is really what's changed is that we're seeing governments step up and much more vocally say, hey, we think these things are important. We know that we need them to be working well. And we need to think through just what are the rules of the road for doing it in a high integrity and transparent way.
And to me, that's such a source of strength that rather than trying to get one committee together to kind of make decisions for everyone, we're kind of seeing these individual laboratories of countries trying out different things, seeing what works. And as you said, it's Singapore, UK, Kenya. Are there certain elements of the implementations that they're doing that you think others could learn from?
Yeah, I think the big interesting space to watch in the next few years is going to be how aligned we can get around that, what I consider sort of framework institutional architecture and rule sets, right? So countries right now are actively thinking about how much should I be taxing these transactions in both the voluntary and the regulatory space? What kind of data do I need to be collecting? What kind of registration process should be in place? Do I need to set up a registry so that I can track what's happening in my country and what gets traded outside? And I don't know if you know this, but like the US federal government doesn't have an official registry to track any kind of internationally traded mechanisms that we might be using. And so I used to work on this when I was at the State Department. And I think it's really interesting when you step back and think about just how early a lot of this infrastructure and process is in many of these countries, and even countries who you would expect to be pretty sophisticated on some of this core foundational elements of building a market really aren't, because it hasn't been a serious part of the conversation yet. So in this instance, I actually think the developing countries in some places are going to be the ones leading the way. And then we'll come around, if we ever get ourselves sorted out here on this stuff, countries like the US will be coming in behind and sort of saying, oh yeah, that looks like a good set of rules. I think we'll consider adopting those or our own flavor. So that's a lot of the work that's going to be happening right now, is just putting that basic market interoperability, interconnectivity, and core infrastructure in place in all of these different places. And the hope is that we can drive some convergence around what those look like so that you don't have 190 different versions of what a carbon markets registry looks like, because that really shouldn't be the case. It's fairly standard in terms of the type of information you would need and the processes that you need to undertake. This is also, I'll just note, I live in philanthropy land now, and I think this is a really important place for philanthropy to come in, because we tried and failed when I was at the State Department to get the UN to put some of this infrastructure in place. And countries just weren't willing to sort of say, okay, yes, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, you guys help us build this. But I think we have this moment in time now where I think we can build it, and philanthropy is fully empowered to go out and sort of just build the things, and they will come because we will solve a bunch of headaches for regulators who are really trying to just wrap their head around how does this all work and how does it fit together.
And as you said, there's just a tremendous amount of work to be done. And I think it's for how long carbon markets have been around, I think people don't realize how early it still is in terms of having all the systems and processes in place that would make them institutional grade, kind of ready for institutional investment, or more colloquially, ready for prime time and ready to unlock that institutional capital and be a true asset investment area that they need to be. What do you think are some of the critical pieces needed to getting these markets ready for prime time?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we're spending a lot of time thinking about right now, and a lot of time working with more traditional capital markets actors who are coming at this. We now have folks in the space who are former securities brokers and bankers at Goldman Sachs and who've been in the commodities markets for, 20 or 30 years and are looking for their next interesting project. And I've really benefited a lot from the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with them about, okay, guys, we've built this kind of artisanal market on the back of well-meaning NGOs who have stepped into this space to help fill this regulatory void. And what do we need to do in order to really get this market ready, as you say, for prime time? And how do we think about building the transparency system? So I think that's first and foremost the most important thing. We don't even have basic pricing discovery in the carbon markets, right? Most trades are over the counter. They tend to be through private bilateral deals. We don't have standardized what we call emission reduction purchase agreements, which means that there's not one universal sort of legal contract for exchanging carbon. Every deal is this sort of bespoke, belabored process to actually do the contracting. We don't have an internationally agreed definition around what the thing actually is. Is it a ton of voided emissions? Is it something else? How are we defining it from a legal perspective? Under which kind of legal system are we defining it, and where is that codified? All of that is still sort of up in the air. And there's a number of processes right now where we're working to drive enhanced international alignment around the legal definition. But that's obviously a pretty fundamental part of being able to take title to something, is that you have legal ownership demonstration and chain of custody. So the chain of custody is another big piece of the puzzle that we're going to have to figure out because of the way that the registries work today. So I think there's a lot of work to upgrade, enhance, standardize, and converge the ways in which the registries are functioning and operating today. We need standard data protocols for how you issue serial numbers. So, like, really just boring kind of nuts and bolts, fundamental building blocks of an actual capital market. All of that we're really working to put in place right now. But it's happening. The work is happening. It's moving forward. I'm very excited about this because I think once we start getting some of these fundamental pieces in place, institutional investors are going to kind of stop looking over the transom and going, ooh, it seems a little messy down there. And actually saying, oh, yeah, okay, here is the clear set of legal and accounting and policy frameworks and documents and guidance that I need in order to really engage with this market as a serious opportunity, both for investment and as an asset in and of itself. So getting this stuff right for this emerging asset class is fundamental to really growing it to a scaled commodity market.
And everything you said sure sounds important in terms of critical infrastructure. I was wondering, when you have conversations with the bankers, like it seems like you were having with the folks at Goldman, are there certain areas that they say like, oh, you need to have this? Or there's certain things that they kind of lit up as a priority?
Absolutely. And I think there's this convergence around fewer methodologies, the just standard data interoperability and naming conventions is a core piece of the puzzle. Doing better and more streamlined KYC work at the registry level. Like when I was a buyer, I had to open, I don't know, 6 different accounts at different registries, and I had to go through a completely different KYC process for every single one of them. It was unbelievable pain in the you know what. And that's just going to need to be fixed. There's no reason why that's the case. It's just a nature of the fragmented kind of early years of this market. So all of that work really needs to accelerate. And that's something we're very focused on. But I think increasingly philanthropy is starting to dig in there and recognize the need and importance for that, and governments as well. It's going to be an exciting couple of years for the market as we move into this next phase of what I call sort of moving out of our awkward teenage years and into becoming a full-fledged adult who's functioning to society and addressing the climate crisis at scale.
I know you're involved in a number of new initiatives. Some are in motion, some might not be able to come to fruition for a little bit. But I was curious if you could give us a little sense of some of the new initiatives that are in motion to get some of these critical pieces in place.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been working a lot on right now is something that we're calling the Verified Carbon Market Roadmap, which is a clear and collective vision for the entire carbon market over the next 5 years to really say, okay, if we want this market to matter from a climate change mitigation perspective, and we've set that target as 5 gigatons of abatement by 2030 collectively, then here are all of the pieces of the puzzle. And this is the vision for the market of the future that we really want to work towards, which is a market that's grounded in scientific and technical rigor. There's a lot of work that needs to happen around just basic science and data, because these are often areas where people just haven't bothered to dig in. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure we have the best underlying data and methods. The equitable and robust market oversight that we were just talking about. So those core market function pieces, and making sure that you have protections in place so that local communities, so that developing countries and host country governments are protected from what we call carbon cowboys, and that we really have good, robust transparency and approval processes in place, is core to making sure that this market really scales. Because if this market isn't working for frontline communities, it's not working for frontline ecosystems, and it's not serving people in addition to the planet, then we aren't doing our job. So that's a really big focus of the work that we're doing. You noted that there was a lot of negative press about the markets. The trusted and transparent communications piece is core. So really making sure that when we're talking about the market, we do a better job of talking about the incredible impact it drives in various places. And we talk about the need for better, more transparent, more trusted communications across the board. And then we start digging into some of the transformative finance pieces. So because this is such a new market, we really need to do a better job of designing and deploying capital at the right prices, in the right shapes, at the right time. And that's going to require, I firmly believe, a blend of philanthropic concessionary capital combined with private finance that comes in. And so making sure that we have all of those pieces of the puzzle in place is going to be really interesting and important. And then lastly, there's no market without demand. So how are we giving companies a reason to buy these things, particularly on a voluntary basis? And how are we making sure that they're baked into regulatory policies and structures as they emerge into developing and developed countries in a way that really builds that robust demand so that we can get to that 5 gigaton plus of abatement over time? So that's what we've been working on a bunch.
And you mentioned a few times now philanthropy. And what we've seen in these markets over the years is there are many aspects of the markets that just they require a little bit of a jump start, whether it was the investment in renewables like solar and wind, where early government investments could help drive down the cost curves and then make them much more economically competitive. It sounds a little bit like you see philanthropy as another source of investment that might not be looking for the most competitive returns, but could help drive through the fundamental change that's needed to make these markets more competitive. What areas would you think would be the best targets for philanthropy right now?
So there's a lot of different places that philanthropy is active in this space and will continue to be active. This work around this, what I call backbone kind of fundamental infrastructure, is definitely an area where the more kind of business minded philanthropies are digging in. and spending a lot of time kind of thinking through how do we get all those pieces in place. And so writing grants to just make sure that that work happens and is as good as it needs to be and has the best legal minds and the best financial accounting minds really at the table is a core part of the work. Also, really doing this kind of trusted, really leaning in on the communications pieces. So, how do we tell the story of these markets that's not a story of fraud and waste and exploitation, but really telling the story of the incredible impact that these markets today are delivering on the ground in terms of transformative and life changing finance for frontline communities. I'm so passionate about this market because I've had the privilege of going and visiting these places and seeing the impact firsthand and talking to the communities who used to have to boil brackish water and now have access to clean drinking water from solar desalination plants in Kenya with our friends at Give Power because carbon market revenue was available, or who used to be cooking with wood and are now cooking with clean fuels, where a forest got cut down and is now replanted and being reforested with natural vegetation, or a standing forest that was going to be cut down and isn't because we were able to use carbon market revenue to keep it standing. So the transformative impact of this money and this market is difficult to overstate and is incredibly important. And so philanthropy just continuing to champion both the reform agenda, making sure that we have that core reform infrastructure and work happening, which is not a small task by any means, combined with this broader effort to really help drive this new vision and set of real world implementation systems in place is a big place for them to come in. I think the other big place, and we're starting to see this in pockets, but really on a small scale, is around concessionary capital provision through things like program-related investments. So often philanthropies will do these things called reimbursable grants, where it's a grant if the project fails, but if it doesn't fail and you're able to raise money or stand up your fund or deploy the capital and get it back again as low-cost debt, that then you get paid back. And so those types of revolving debt facilities and revolving capital management programs that philanthropies can be incredibly impactful in getting cost-effective, kind of proof of concept, first of its kind types of financial structures out into the world that the private capital markets just won't touch until they've been proven and de-risked. Philanthropy often will come in with a first loss tranche. So we'll say, look, we'll provide a guarantee. And we're starting to see some really exciting work in that space with sovereign debt guarantees and debt for nature swaps that are happening, where large, very wealthy individuals have come in and said, look, I'll put up $25 million of kind of at-risk money to provide a first loss guarantee in case this sovereign government defaults on its debt. Likelihood of it actually defaulting, very low, but that really helps unlock other money. So that catalytic role of philanthropic dollars and unlocking other money is really fundamental in my mind to helping us build to a integrated and truly transformative capital market stack that gets the market going.
How much have things not been going? When you get down to the project level, the boots on the ground level, how big is the capital shortfall been in terms of impact on the projects that are actually getting done?
I would say billions. There is, interestingly, though, here the signal from noise question. I hear from folks in the market that there are a lot of investments being made right now in nature-based removal projects in particular. So large-scale reforestation, wetland restoration, mangrove restoration. There are investors coming in and sort of making these long-term bets on these capital intensive projects that are likely going to sort of have paybacks in the 10 to 20 year time frame. So mobilizing those patient capital investors into this market is going to be really important. But the market did contract last year quite significantly, actually. So there was a recent report from Ecosystem Marketplace. They do an annual sizing. And in 2023, the volume of the market was down significantly. It came back up in 2024, but we're still hovering around $750 million for the market overall. So it really, truly is a rounding error at this point. You never know it considering the hysteria in the media about this market. But it's from an international capital markets perspective, right? Like we're a rounding error. And so I would like that to change. And I want it to be on the back of really high integrity credits and demonstrated atmospheric and environmental impact, because that's the purpose of the market. So if it's not doing that, then it's not doing its job.
Well, thanks so much for catching up with us and letting us kind of into everything that you see going on in these markets. Really glad we're able to have this conversation because while on the surface, it may seem like things are quiet in voluntary carbon market land, under the surface, a lot's happening. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you see the carbon markets developing over the next year? And are there key milestones that we should be looking out for?
Yes, the next 2 years, I think, are going to be pivotal for the market overall. The milestones that I would be keeping a particularly close eye on are some of the more boring and mundane things, like the FASB updated accounting rules for how we didn't talk about this, but it's really important and top of mind for us is getting the balance sheet treatment of these assets right. So how they're being recorded. Are they intangible assets? Are they assets? Are they recognized as an expense upon retirement or upon receipt? All of those things are going to have really big impacts on the capital formation for the space as a whole. Also looking at the regulatory and compliance systems and the signals that we're hearing from governments like the UK, like the EU, who just announced last week that they'll be opening their 2040 market to international credits. That was a big moment in change. And the EU tends to be a real regulatory and policy leader, as you know, around climate action and mitigation broadly. And so keeping an eye on what's coming out of the EU is going to be very important. And then the other big bellwether is just, can we keep the big tech companies and the climate leaders in the boat? So we're spending a lot of time making sure that we are doing a good job celebrating the leadership that many of these companies are bringing and making sure that we are helping to continue to give companies a reason to buy, because we need them to be writing these checks and continuing to buy. And so as companies hopefully start getting more confident and comfortable around the regulatory structures and the fact that, yes, these are going to be in policy, these are going to be allowed, they're going to be accepted, and we've collectively landed on what quality looks like through the work of the ICBCM and others, that's going to open the door for enhanced action, transparency, and reporting. So it's going to be a big couple of years for the carbon markets. Folks should stay tuned and don't be dismayed if things are a little quiet, because there is a tremendous amount of work happening behind the scenes to make sure that this market is ready for prime time.
Thanks again to Alexia Kelly, Managing Director, Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the High Tide Foundation. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Catching Up on Climate. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is presented by Base Carbon, a financier of projects involved primarily in the global voluntary carbon markets. Base Carbon endeavors to be the preferred carbon project partner in providing capital and management resources to carbon removal and abatement projects globally, and where appropriate, will utilize technologies within the evolving environmental industries to enhance efficiencies, commercial credibility, and trading transparency. For more information, visit basecarbon.com. Base Carbon, sensible carbon investing. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.